everyone in the room will know, is being flexible and responding to events and timings. So that, in fact, is what we the panel have decided to do. So I can promise you that we will finish in good time to get to the sound walk, which is happening later. So what we're planning to do is to, firstly, I'm slightly conscious that in some ways this has been what Bernard would describe as a little bit one-way traffic. I can feel around me in the room, people are bursting with ideas and thoughts and responses and longing to kind of pitch in. At least I think you are, but we'll test that assumption later. There might, of course, be a deafening silence, in which case we can start the sound walk earlier. But I'm also keen to just sort of pick up with the panel a few sort of observations from things that have happened during the day, and then, as I say, open it up and get some other thoughts from you guys, should you have them. Let me introduce both myself and the panel. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Susanna Eastburn, and I am, in my day job, is Chief Executive of Sound and Music, which is the UK's national organisation for new music supporting the work of composers. And if I can just do a tiny plug for Sound and Music, that radio show Drive Time Underground that Jenny Walsh just referenced is something that we supported, so I'm quite proud of that. I'm also president of the International Association of Music Information Centres, which is having its annual meeting right now here in Galway. Over the weekend we've had 2.5 really productive days and then this brilliant public conference. It's also been absolutely delightful to be here at the same time as our colleagues from Ars Acoustica, although it did slightly kick off in the bar last night, so I apologise if I was rude to anyone. Didn't mean to be. Anyway, let me introduce my panellists very briefly and then we'll get stuck in. So, starting on your left, my right, Kenneth Kileen. Kenneth is the artistic director of the Improvised music company, which is Ireland's leading promoter of jazz and ethnic music, and it's a really important resource for Irish jazz musicians. And he's also clearly very, very well networked throughout Europe, including through the European Jazz Network, and he's also a guitarist, as far as I understand. Marcus is one of my Ars Acoustica colleagues. He coordinates the Ars Acoustica group, which is part of the Euradio EBU project. Perhaps you can explain it a bit better than me in a minute, actually. And you're a music journalist, a dramaturg, and a radio maker. You make programs for Deutschland Radio Kultur. And then on my immediate right is Ed Harsh, who is president and chief executive of New Music USA, which is basically the new music organisation for composers across the United States. So that's a lot of composers. And Ed brings to this panel a really wide range of experience, both in terms of organisations that he's worked for, which in various different roles. He's worked for the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. He's run a new music ensemble, but he's also an active composer. His teachers include Louis Andriessen. He's composed music for the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, amongst others. And his most important role, in my eyes, is that he is vice president of IAMIC, and therefore an enormous support to me personally. So, I'd like to start, if you're ready to give a quick observation. Actually, I was going to start. Who should I start with? I might start. I might start with Ed, actually, who I was sitting next to, and you were sort of writing many things down. It'd be great to have one or more observations from you, responding to what you've heard so far today, and any thoughts you have about that.
Sure. So I understand I have to speak very closely to the mic, so I lean forward. So I think I have actually tried to keep track of all the things we've been talking about, and that is rather silly because although there's an excellent central core, and I think it's been a really great day, there are a lot of different thoughts I have. So I'm going to try to be semi-coherent on one point, and then if we have dead silence, I can actually try to be semi-coherent on the other points later. But I think the word that kept on running through my mind throughout the day was relationship. And I was honestly quite challenged by Kevin's talk this morning, mostly in a good way, I think. But I was really struck by one thing particularly he said, and I don't mean to take it out of context, but he suggested that the composer's relationship to an audience has been reduced to, quote unquote, how can we drag in audiences to cover our costs? unquote. And I may have written down wrong, I probably am taking it out of context. But rather than, I'm not saying that as an accusatory thing, but I thought to myself, wow, is that really the way I think about an audience? And my answer, of course, is no, personally. But then I was really, as I was kind of tipped off to that relationship issue throughout the day, I heard all sorts of really interesting words. Let me see if I wrote down some of them. Brian talked about symbiosis. Lucy talked about two-way interaction. Of course, we heard that a lot throughout the day. Karen, I guess it was, talked about the value of listeners. And then with respect to David talking about actually micro-analyzing his audience down to individual people, there's real relationship there and valuing of a relationship. And so I think that what, for me, this kind of thinking in this way throughout the day has kind of underlined for me that for me there is actually a really philosophically strong position to take that puts the value of what we do not just in kind of an abstract creation of an aesthetic object, as the phrase is sometimes used, but in the creation of a relationship with different groups of people. And that feels very powerful to me. And actually, it in a way, it gives kind of, again, it kind of underlines all the things we're talking about, how to grow audiences, develop audiences, build audiences. It's all kind of part of the art. That it's not just a kind of a side thing of like, oh no, we don't have, the audience isn't full, we have to fill the audience. That's not what it's about actually having the relationship and getting the relationship right and having this relationship scale, ideally. So that's kind of the thing that's been running through my head the most throughout the day. As I say, there are many other things, but that's probably the thing I would single out.
Great. So there's a really interesting point there about the relationship with the audience shouldn't be a transactional one, actually. It is a relationship one and part of the artistic process. Kevin, can I go to you next, actually? Because also it'd be very interesting, being here in Ireland as a practitioner yourself, it'd be great to hear what's particularly resonated with you.
Sure. Well, I suppose a couple of things jumped out at me today in terms of key takeaways. One is the sort of multifaceted nature of audiences in general, which is something that we kind of know is intrinsically true. I mean, audiences are not one-dimensional beings, and the word omnivore was used earlier. I think that's very apt. But organizations typically don't think of their audience as multifaceted. Sometimes they think of them as this binary relationship to what they have to offer. And I think that can be sometimes where issues might happen around programming and sort of if you have, we're a small nation and you have multiple agencies programming together, there's this sort of cannibalization of that audience. And the biggest issue with that, in my opinion, is there are so many options for audiences now not to go anywhere, actually to stay at home. When you're faced with a multitude of choices, Netflix was mentioned earlier, but we live in this culture of now and this culture of sort of an instant gratification through streaming models and all of these things, and we're competing with that in a live environment. And if we present too many overlapping choices, this multifaceted audience will just turn the other way and sort of stay at home. So that's something that kind of it trends across all of the genres. It doesn't matter what music you are promoting; it's a live environment that you're trying to attract people to. The other key thing that was a takeaway for me is about this concept of experiential events, the idea of a hard juxtaposition between the music and its location. And there's lots of really good work on this around Europe. There's a professor, Tony Whiten, in Birmingham City University, has done some really interesting research in a project called Chime, which is cultural heritage and improvised music throughout Europe, and using location as a sort of a key factor in getting audiences in, both to enrich the experience of the music, but also to enrich where they are and their understanding and awareness of where they are. So the two big things for me were this kind of multifaceted nature of audiences, and also about the need to sort of carefully program, knowing that people have many, many options now, more than they would have had 10, 15 years ago.
And the first point in particular is a really interesting counterpoint to Bernard's point about the single listener, because actually you're saying something a bit different.
Well, I am, but I mean, Bernard's point was very, very, it kind of hit the nail on the head for me, in that you need to think in this focused way about this one listener. Absolutely, but this one listener is somebody who they're just, it's a torrent of information flooding people at the moment, you know. And actually, live music can be an antidote to all of that. And I think if you position it like that, position the live prospect like that, or position the radio show like that, then you're creating something that has a different value to it. You're actually putting value on it in the context of all this other sort of throwaway stuff, you know. So while I'm saying something different in terms of the multifaceted nature of audiences, I kind of agree with Bernard on his one listener concept, because that's the way you need to approach it in order to sort of deliver the quality and the variety that Bernard does on his show.
Yeah, to do anything of meaning. Marcus, what about you? What are your takeaways, your kind of headline observations?
Well, one headline I would like to put maybe on top or against many things that have been said is truism, which is the best way to build an audience is make a good program. Just I think we need to remember that every once in a while, that this is the core feature. And then I jumped upon one thing that Jennifer was saying about fitting squares into circles. So I think this is the core thought that can tie many things together that have been hovering around today, is fit things really well. So on the radio, for instance, of course, there is this one listener thought, and on the radio here in the Acoustica group, which is an art form of making sound for and in the radio, we have this experience that this works particularly well if we make the artist think of the radio in the first place. So if we not necessarily go out and capture a concert that is made for a concert space, but rather conceive the radio as a concert space. So this is what Jennifer also was talking about for how she uses the internet. And this you can actually expand on the way you also conceive concerts or festivals. I think in London it's being done great, or in Berlin we have this very long ongoing festival called CTM, Club Transmediale was called before. And one key to their access is that they know very well what kind of audience they're targeting, which is people who are like kind of in the creative scene, but in very different worlds. So it may be visual people or film people or people just in related fields, but who are open to sound, and then provide them with a communication and with a program that kind of resonates with their world, and this results in a major turnout. They have 25,000 visitors every year. So I think, making things fit is a good advice.
Great. Can I do this?
You'll be free as well.
I'm free. And actually, before I open up to the audience, I guess I would like to momentarily take off my chairing hat and come up with I would like to say something about listening. And I'm going to start, I guess, with what I think will be the last Morton Feldman anecdote of the day. For which I have to thank Kevin Volans, actually, because he corrected me when I tried to remember it earlier. So this is about Stefan Wolper, who was teaching Morton Feldman. And Wolper asked Feldman, he said, "What about the man in the street?" And they looked out of the window, and Jackson Pollock was walking past. So he is your single listener, potentially. I guess the point I want to make, actually, is that listening well is really, really hard work. And composers, of course, know that. And the years of training, which Kevin described as being really essential to be a fully formed composer, a lot of that is about the inner ear, about the power of listening internally and translating that into something that communicates to other people. And I guess us as sort of presenters, producers in our various roles, every time any of us put on an event, we are asking our audiences to stop what they're doing, to not watch Netflix, to not go and watch the football, and to actually stop what they're doing and come and listen to us. And I think that as producers and presenters of music, and as a general rule, although today we've heard many great exceptions, so it's very inspiring to have the exceptions, but as a general rule, I think we want to persuade people to listen to us, but we're not actually that interested in listening properly to them. It's actually much more convenient to hear what we think they say, which oddly enough often reinforces what we believe about ourselves, which is exactly the point that David made earlier. I'd like to sort of illustrate this slightly dysfunctional approach to sort of hearing and listening in audiences with an example from the UK. And this is an artistic director of a very major cultural institution who shall remain nameless because it's a shameful anecdote. And it was a major arts venue which was struggling with its box office targets. And let's get clear what that means for a major arts organisation. It meant that they were still getting thousands of people coming through their doors, but not quite as many thousands as they had aimed at. And the thing about those audiences who were coming through the doors is that in some mysterious way they were the wrong type of audience. So these were people who loved the work of the company, were very loyal to it, and kept coming back despite really not being the right kind of audience. And this, the artistic director of this company memorably described his audience, the target audience of this place, as being this culturally curious sort of multi-art form, cosmopolitan, the kind of people we've been talking about all day today, and that was his ideal audience. And he came out with the memorable quote, "I know who my audience is, they're just not coming here at the moment." So this goes back to the notion of the profound respect that Kevin raised at the beginning of the day. And it's interesting, Ed, you took something very different from Kevin's speech than I did. So I really heard the thing about the relationship of profound respect between composer and audience. And I think we as producers and presenters can easily fall into the trap. Obviously, many of us hopefully don't all the time, but many of us can fall into the trap of not being respectful in those ways. So going back to listening. So if you listen well, you do hear some uncomfortable truths. And actually, they're not just uncomfortable, they're actually just bloody obvious truths. So we heard earlier about the new Aud programme, which saw many more people going to concerts. And this programme seemed to show that if we think carefully about how we talk about the work we're going to do, the music we're going to present, if we think about where it happens, if we think about how it's prepared and performed, if we think about how it's programmed and how it's presented, then audiences are more likely to come along and they're more likely to have a good time. And the startling thing here is that it took a major EU programme to find that out, which I think is really, I find it astonishing that it seems so self-evident, and yet these truths somehow needed uncovering by this major project. So I guess I would leave what I have to say by saying, why do we find this so hard? And what stops us from being interested in listening to people properly? And with that, I'm going to open up to the audience, if anyone would like to say anything. Kevin, we've quoted you extensively, so you may want to say something.
I would just like to clarify that quote. I was talking about the music industry and business as being the enemies of composers because of this budget-driven approach where they seemed to feel that they had to drag audiences in to cover their costs. So I was regarding that as the profound enemy of composition.
So the dragging in being done by the organisers rather than composers.
Yeah. Thanks.
Right. No, I apologize if I misunderstood to some extent, and it could be that you talked about the kind of turn to the dark side of things in the 80s, which is exactly the moment I was struggling to actually resist in some ways what I was being taught, which resonated in many ways with some of the things you were saying. So it could have been I was just talking about what was in my head as opposed to what you said, and if that's the case, I apologize.
Are there other questions, comments, reflections on the day, reflections on anything that we've been saying? David. Oh, and actually, sorry, I meant to say, can you say who you are and where you're from?
I'm David Pay from Music on Main in Vancouver. And in response, Susanna, to your last comment about why is it so bloody hard, it's because we work so bloody hard and we care so bloody much, and we will never, because it should be specialized composers making extraordinary music for an audience that will never be as large as Beyonce's. And we would love to have greater impact, and even if we have our greatest impact, I still don't think it'll be as much as Beyonce's. And so I feel like we're actually just afraid to find the truth, and that we don't want somebody to negate all of the hard work we've done by showing us the work that we still have to do.
Marcus, do you want to?
Maybe just another try on why it might be difficult. It's well, since there's this big tradition we're kind of dragging along in our backpack, and which is our great treasure, but sometimes also weighing us down. Especially the institutions we are working in, they just have their way of working that has developed over decades, if not more. And this is something very difficult to change. I mean, Bernard, you know what I'm talking about in the radios. To just find out that internet is there and we have to deal with it is it's been a very long process. And so this is something we need to tackle, to step back and just try to rethink things from scratch every once in a while. And I'm already this morning and now again, I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable with this black and white, oh dear, bad commodification is kind of killing us. Because, of course, I'm against commodification, but this is, I'm always getting suspicious if things are repeated so many times, and all the listener typologies you've heard. I mean, they, in a way, they date back to Adorno and earlier, and all the philosophy that comes with it, the package that they have, are kind of transported through this way of analyzing listeners and listening habitudes and listener types. And sometimes maybe it also helps to do away with these black and white things. And if a marketing concept helps me bring my intention through, then the hell with it being commodified, just go for it.
Kenneth, I'd be quite interested to know your take on that.
Yeah, I think there's, for me anyway, there's two types of listening. I mean, there's the active listening, the required active listening in some live environments, and a lot of live environments, and there's the passive listening, which is what is happening through the commoditization and the utilization of music through streaming services and stuff like that. I mean, for mainstream audiences, for them, their life, their musical life is put on shuffle, defined by an algorithm on a digital platform, and it's not front and center. I mean, it's a long way from, the analogy of a vinyl record, the analog environment of a vinyl record, where you put on side A, you sit down, you listen to that. When side A is done, you get up, you turn it over, and you put on side B. I mean, that's completely different in terms of an experience as a music listener. But the majority of people, the mainstream people that listen to music in the world, they don't care about any of that stuff. They don't care about bit rates. They don't care about quality so much. And I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, but my point is that we're kind of living in this passive listening culture where music is a background to whatever is happening, and that sort of young people. I mean, people from 12 up. I think earlier today it was the key point that was made. I think Heather made it about 12. Being the age when a lot of young children had their sort of choices already made for them, and that's when sort of peer pressure is at its most, and it's only later on in life. And you can see in other countries in Europe, Norway is a good example, where there's quite a lot of choices given to young children through the education curriculum. And we could talk all day about the sort of being a music of pedagogy or not, and that's that's a day's or two's worth of discussion there. But I think that what the result is in a country like Norway is that a person who's 12 or 13 years old has a sort of a more mature outlook by being exposed to more different types of active listening environments through curricula and so forth, and that in turn makes them, they can create better musical choices if they want to play in ensembles and stuff like that at a young age. And I think that it's foisted upon a lot of people here, and they have to make a lot of these choices in a kind of like a 2 to 3 year window, which is going to define, this next 6 or 7 years of their life. So that I see is a problem, and that sort of perpetuates the passive listening environment, because music then is not as important. It's not a focused thing. It is actually something that is just a commodity for them. So for me, it's kind of, and the active listening is not just what audiences, what potential audiences do. It's what we need to do as promoters and organisations to listen to each other and sort of understand how each other works, because everybody here who works in an organisation is kind of at the coalface, and everybody here in an organisation has essentially got a critical patient on the table that they're dealing with at all times, right? So it's very hard to interact with other peer organisations, irrespective again of music genre, because they're so busy dealing with these and then the uncertainties of funding and all of these other sort of things that come up. But I do think that for the benefit of the audience, the multifaceted one, whatever you want to call it, for the benefit of that, we need to listen to each other more across genres as organisations who are not in mainstream music, so that we can work together to serve this one audience and serve them as best we can.
I don't think anyone would disagree with that, and I shall another takeaway I now have is my organisation is critical patient on operating table, which feels good to me. Are there other comments or questions from the audience? We have one here.
Unfortunately, I am late, and stop me if it has been discussed earlier. I'm a teacher, and I also work for Music for Galway. I'm on board for the last 10 years there. From my experience, it should be really for kids started from the very beginning at school. If you teach literature, it can't be without music. It can't. If you speak about any literature piece, it is always supported. It should be always supported by music. Classical, modern classical, anything. And then the ear of a young listener starts to be acquainted with something without which they can't live. The same with the paintings, the same with the other arts. From this age onwards, it should be really integral part.
There was a very good session earlier where Heather Maitland showed some research about, as Kenneth just said, that you sort of need to encourage those listening and that breadth of listening, the open ears, before the age of 12. So I think absolutely kind of music education, which is very challenging in many countries at the moment, but that is very much part of the key to the future. Are there other... I'm just keen...
The teachers should be trained how to really to deal with it.
Yeah.
And teachers of English and literature.
Yeah. Thank you. So Kenneth, and then that. Thank you there.
Sorry, just something very quickly before I forget, and I think it's important with regard to perspective on all of this. One of the festivals that we run is called 12 Points, and it's a pan-European festival. We choose one band per country each year, 12 bands to perform new and innovative music under this 12 Points banner. And 12 Points started 10 years ago because we had audience development issues, and we had sort of, musician development issues, and we thought we had a set of problems that were unique to Ireland or to Irish musicians. This sort of introverted nature of some of the publicity and these things. That just we honestly thought we had some problems, and this was our Trojan horse into Europe, actually, to insert Irish artists, to put Ireland geographically peripheral in the middle of Europe, even in mind share, was very important to us. And it was an application process. It still is an application process. We get 500-600 applications per year from all over Europe. And it quickly became apparent that the problems that we have here in Ireland are not just here in Ireland. They're replicated in every other country. Even I mentioned Norway earlier, a country that gets a lot of praise, and they certainly have enough money. But they have the same problems with regard to dissemination. They have the same problems with regard to promotional aspects. This kind of like, there's almost a retarded nature in all of these, irrespective of where they are. So I think it's very important to understand that if we're talking about listening, in this environment here in Ireland, it's actually very, very instructive to look at other countries in Europe that may have had similar problems. This could have been 8 years ago, it could have been 12 years ago, it could have been in the late 70s and somewhere in another country in Europe, and the response to it, and we could actually look to other countries in Europe because actually there's so many of these problems are universal and they're not country specific. So I think if we can look further afield, we might actually be able to see something that may or may not have worked for them there but could apply here. So that's just a perspective thing that I think is very important to consider.
Great, and that's of course also something that we very much seek to try and do through the IAMIC network, the global network of music centres, many of whom are here now. You had a question here.
Yep. So just in relation to the ears being closed at 12, I'd just like to counter that by sort of saying that actually I believe they close at 4. So really, if we're talking about young people, I think we need to get in there even earlier. And really, once they start going into the schooling system, then the idea of what is music and what is sound and everything else just sort of gets put in, and it's very, very difficult to pull that back out again. But actually, that's not why I asked for the microphone. I just wanted to, sorry. I wanted to touch on something that was said earlier, but maybe not. I mean, it's been implied in everything that's been said, but maybe just the very notion that everything we're talking about takes time. It's happening in real time, and it takes time. And because it takes time, it will constantly evolve. And our listeners are constantly evolving, and we are constantly evolving. And so, and I know, it seems, again, really, really obvious, but I invariably hear this sort of, what's the solution, and what's the, and of course, there is none. It's simply a constantly evolving platform, and it should be, and it sort of goes back to everything everybody's saying, that it needs to keep evolving and changing, and unfortunately that will take a lot more time than I think most of us are willing to maybe acknowledge.
Thank you. I think we have to wrap up there, but that actually feels like a good place to end, that this is work in progress, and indeed picking up on Kenneth's points before, it's work in progress that we are not alone in addressing. So I'd like to thank all of you, and indeed my lovely panel. Sorry it was a bit shorter than we thought, but it was great to hear some more voices in the room, and to actually have a chance to sort of regroup and reflect on some of the things that we have heard during the day. So thank you very much.